I didn't know the last time that I was here, and what floors me every time is this is going to be on Olelo, right? So friends and friends of friends will call me this whole next year and say, I saw you talking about coral reefs. You got me all excited. I hope so, because that's my intention tonight. I want to talk to you about the place where we live. Oh, I have to figure this out, sorry. Which is here. We are all about right here, right now. And my place is across the street, kind of back up here. This is where I call home. I've been in Hawaii for just about 30 years right now. But I didn't always live here. How many of you were born here? Wow, awesome. Okay, so you're not like some of us who had to find our way to the most beautiful place on earth. I was born on this continent, kind of right there, in a crazy little town called Wichita Falls, Texas. I know. So it's known for tumbleweeds and oil wells and girls with big hair. And I am a Cowboys fan. I can't help it. It's just genetic. But my folks were kind enough when I was a little kid, about 5 years old, to move us from Texas to Southern California. Talk about a weird place to grow up. There is Disneyland there, but it's also kind of strange because everything is concrete. The first island that I saw that I knew was an island is this one right here. It's not really an island. It's an oil platform made to look like an island. And I was, this is in the early 60s. And I was kind of, I don't know, I didn't know what I wanted to do with life, so I went to my hometown school, Cal State in Long Beach, Southern California. And I thought I wanted to be a pediatrician. Why not? I had one. Maybe I could do that. I just didn't know what I wanted to be. And then the first semester at college, I didn't even know quite how I got to college. I kind of stumbled there. But first semester in college, I met this cute boy in my botany class. And I thought, well, okay, so what are you doing? And he was working in a marine pollution lab, brand new. This is the early 70s now. And I kind of hung out with him and his friends, and they gave me a job in the Marine Pollution Studies lab, and I was making $1.45 an hour to sort through the mud from the bottom of Los Angeles Harbor to look for pollution indicator species. I was so excited. And I was there for about, I don't know, 2 or 3 months, and they gave me a raise, and I was making $1.55 an hour. Crazy about this cute boy. This is the place that I'm talking about. Does that look like a natural environment to grow up in? I had no clue. I mean, and nature, come on. Every so often there was a grasshopper in the backyard, you know, and I knew about mom's roses, but this is not a natural environment to grow up in. So, okay, I'm now about 21 years old, getting ready to graduate from college. Kind of stumbled through. But I followed the cute boy to Florida, where we were going to go to school some more. Because school's a great place to be. You know, it's kind of got a safety net. And one thing I can do is get good grades. So we went to South Florida and Tampa. And it's an interesting place to be. I was working on my master's. He was working on his PhD. So that all happened. And then we moved across the state of Florida to a place called Port Fierce. No, it's called Fort Pierce. I'm joking, but it's the weirdest place in the world. It's right in the middle of East Florida, between like Fort Lauderdale and Cape Canaveral, and from where we used to live in Tampa, you could look across the state of Florida and see them launching the space shuttle. That's how flat Florida is. But I got to work for a place called the Smithsonian. They have a research lab in the middle of Florida in Fort Pierce. And see this little map right here? This little treasure map with the gold coin on it? The fun thing there was that I was studying these funny little worms. I had a job, get this, to study funny little worms that live deep in the sand, like this deep in the sand. We didn't even know about them until the treasure hunters off of the east coast of Florida, and they have these boat platforms, and they blow a big hole in the sand. I have to tell you a little bit about this. They have a boat. You guys know about boats, right? So they anchor a boat with 4 corners, and then they have a big PVC elbow over the engine. They rev the engine, but the boat can't go because it's anchored in 4 corners in the sand, right? So what happens? The prop wash blows down, and it blows up the sand. And this is a place where in 1748, there was a bunch of shipwrecks off the east coast of Florida. So they're looking for gold and silver and archaeological treasure. But they keep blowing up these wonderful little worms that we're interested in. So I got to go diving on these treasure wrecks and bring in these worms called peanut worms that look like this. And these worms, here's the treasure chest, here's the adult worm. When these worms reproduce, they make little worms, but before that, they have, I try not to say baby because in my field we're not supposed to say baby, but these are their babies that look like this. They're the most gorgeous creatures. They're teeny-tiny, and they come in every color in the rainbow, orange, blue, green, purple, and they live in the plankton. And they live in the plankton, floating, for about a year. They live in the surface of the plankton, and if you floated around in the Atlantic Ocean for a year in the upper surface of the water, what do you think would happen? Would you get a little bit sunburned? Well, we would, but they don't. So I was really kind of curious about why these beautiful little tiny gorgeous creatures did not get sunburned. Okay, I have to tell you a little bit more of the story. So the cute boy ran off with a secretary at the lab. Broke my heart into a bazillion pieces. Anybody recognize that story? So I didn't know what to do, but I had met a professor along the way. He happened to be from University of Hawaii. And he ran into me at the lab and said, you know what, why don't you come to Hawaii, go to graduate school? You were always smarter than he was anyway. Knocked my socks off. Nobody has ever said this to me before. Nobody's ever said anything like this to me before. I've been stumbling, bumbling along. I can take a test. That's what I can do. But this guy said, you can think. Come to Hawaii. So I packed it up, left Florida. I arrived here with 2 suitcases and my Schwinn bike in 1982. And the prof and his wife picked me up at the airport and took me to the YWCA in Punahou, dropped me off, said goodnight, and I was rooming with a really neat woman, but she could only speak Japanese and I could only speak English, so we were trying to figure out how life was going to go. Anyway, I'm going to skip ahead, okay? I just wanted to tell you that sometimes it goes like this. So I got here. Here's a map of where we are. This map always blows my mind. These are islands that come up right from the bottom of the ocean, isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And again, this place drew me. The main campus of University of Hawaii is over the mountain in Manoa, but the place that drew my attention was right this way, about 100 yards from here. So I took some classes at Coconut Island, Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, and I was hooked. Remember, I came here to study those little worm larvae that live in the plankton, but I saw the reefs of Kaneohe Bay and thought, wow, Wow, this is really, really interesting. So I'm here to talk to you tonight about something that captivated me now 30 years ago, and just want to tell you some stories. So coral reefs are related to these things like sea anemones or jellyfish. How could that be? Well, because they all belong to the same group of creatures on this planet, Cnidaria, we call them. Some of them are just a simple sac with a mouth surrounded by a ring of tentacles, and others, like a jelly, are a simple sac with a mouth surrounded by a ring of tentacles. That's kind of cool to begin with. These are the relationships that biologists love to study. The other thing that they share in common is that they can sting. Has anybody ever kissed a sea anemone or run into a Portuguese man-o-war? They sting. You kissed a sea anemone? I did. And it hurt. But if you run into a jelly, which you did, it stings like crazy. They have these amazing stinging cells called cnidae. This is what a coral reef, a reef-building coral, looks like close up. So here's this mouth, here's the ring of tentacles, and it's a very simple, and it's an animal. It's an animal, and I'm going to tell you why in just a minute. So it has an outside shown here in green, an inside shown here in red. Very simple, but it produces a hard skeleton. Have you guys been out on the reef out front? You've seen it. You know that it's hard. If you kick it, it hurts your foot. It's a hard skeleton, and the skeletons of corals make a big difference in a lot of areas like Hawaii, other Pacific, Atlantic, Indian Ocean islands, in protecting shorelines, and they make a place where other species live and thrive. This is a close-up of a coral colony. See the little mouths? Here's one, here's one, here's one, surrounded by rings of tentacles. If I was a little fish coming up to nibble on this coral, whoop, those coral polyps, we call them, pull down into the spaces that they have built into the skeleton. And now it's harder, if I'm a little fish, to bite them. Corals come in beautiful colors. These photos are actually taken from at the Waikiki Aquarium, showing the beautiful coral color. These are some of our local species. And the thing that I'd like for you to think about right now is crazy. I just said that corals are animals like us. But inside their cells, they have this. Algae, a plant, a single-cell plant, I'm not making this up, that lives inside their cells. What do plants do for a living? What does corn, flour do for a living? They photosynthesize. They take energy from the sun and make food that we eat, right? Corn, peas, carrots, or coral reefs. So all of these corals have inside their cells photosynthetic algae, and they're called, I love this word, zooxanthellae. But imagine that if instead of like going through the drive-through, you could just pull up your sleeve and expose your cells to the sun, you could photosynthesize and make some food that would be good for you. So these little tiny cells live inside the coral polyps and give them that color. How do they get these cells? Some of them are born with them because when the mom produces an egg, she puts the algae inside the egg. Whoa. So the egg goes off into the water and it's able to get food from the sun as it floats around in the ocean. Crazy, I know. Some moms don't do that for their eggs. They just throw them out there and they have to float around, develop, land on the bottom, and get their own algae. That's tough. So what they do is, we don't even know how this happens, but the algae either gets into their mouth or they find them and pull them in, and they eat them, but they don't digest them. They just incorporate them into their bodies. This is amazing stuff, and this is stuff that science doesn't quite understand right now. I'm telling you what I know. It's not just corals, though, that have these amazing algae inside them. Giant clams. Who's been to Waikiki Aquarium? Anybody? Whoa, awesome. I love this place. And they have some giant clams in one of their major tanks. When the giant clams first arrived, they were about this big, almost 30 years ago. Now these clams are about this big, almost 200 pounds, and they have never been fed. They've never been fed. How did that happen? They have the algae inside their tissue, take the energy from the sun, turn it into food. That's how they survive. They're gigantic. They've been there almost 30 years living on sunlight. All right. That's the best of all possible worlds. Sometimes the world doesn't work that way. Sometimes there's stress in the world. And for a coral, excuse me, that stress can be when the water gets too hot, like when global warming begins, when the water gets too murky, there's not enough light. So we have been observing, as scientists, this phenomenon called coral bleaching for the last 30, 40 years. More and more often as the seawater temperatures get warmer. So when things get tough, this wonderful association, we call it a symbiosis between the algae and the coral, breaks down. When things get tough, the relationship falls apart. And we don't know what happens to the algae, but we know that the coral suffers. And when the coral suffers, most of the time it dies, sometimes it recovers. But a few years ago, there was a big bleaching event in the Indian Ocean, and the majority of the corals on the coral reefs there died. This is big stuff in my field. But not all corals die at the same time. This is a photo taken a number of years ago, right off of Lanikai here. Same conditions, right next to each other. The coral at the top still looks healthy. The coral below obviously has bleached. When it bleaches, it doesn't have its food source anymore, so it's definitely challenged. Okay, I'm going to switch gears here. Are you ready to talk about sex? Why not? Yeah, why not? This is what gets my mom engaged in what I do. When I tell her that corals have sex, she's like, what? I thought you worked on rocks. Corals are, I just told you, animals. They have plants that live inside their cells. They make a stony skeleton. So that's already 3 things, right? And they have to reproduce. They're animals. And this is what it looks like. I should have turned the lights down a little bit. So this is a coral branch. And this is not an egg. Get this. I'm here to tell you crazy stuff tonight. This is an egg sperm bundle. Say it in your mind. Don't say it out loud. Egg sperm bundle. What? What is she talking about? This is a bundle of eggs, about 8 to a dozen, a dozen eggs, wrapped around a bundle of sperm inside. What? So the coral that makes this is female and male in that same polyp. Amazing. So mama data polyp, when it's ready, produces a bundle of eggs and sperm. Now the eggs in this bundle are all fatty. This is all about females and fatty. Lipids. And lipids are fat and they float. So the eggs give the sperm a ride to the surface because they float up. And then, here's what happens. Oh, there's so much to tell you. So some corals are female and male at the same time. Other corals are either female or male. If you think you understand a coral, then the next thing you know, they're doing something different. So corals can be either male and female or different sexes. This is a male coral. Can you check that out? Spawning. This is sperm going off into the water, actually at Coconut Island. This is a photo from a helicopter on the Great Barrier Reef after a big night of coral spawning in Australian springtime, which is October, November. So these are little islands, and this is eggs and sperm and, and developing coral embryos the next morning. Holy mackerel. The students in Australia who discovered this in the early 1980s were interesting young students who could stay up all night and observe this going on. Can you imagine that through the ages nobody had seen this before? Well, I'm pretty sure that some islanders had seen this before, but nobody had written it down. So in about the mid-1980s, a couple of Australians came up to Coconut Island and talked to the students and researchers here and said, we know something you don't know, and we can tell you how to know what's going on with Hawaiian corals. Show us. All right. So here's some of those egg sperm bundles. Can you see the little white center? That's the sperm in the middle. And here's an egg sperm bundle breaking up. You can see the eggs clearly, and the bundle of sperm in the middle is starting to spread out. They've had a ride to the surface, hopefully to interact with other individuals and make coral, I'm going to say it, coral babies. This is what a coral baby looks like. Is that adorable or what? Looks like a little Smurf. It's very simple. They're very simple organisms, but they've been around for about 250 million years. 240 million years. So whatever they're doing is working. So this little Smurf swims around for a few hours, a few days, maybe a few months even. Swims around and kind of senses what's going on in the bottom if it doesn't get eaten or if it doesn't die. It does better, go back here for a sec, it does better if mom has packed it with zooxanthellae, the algae that can photosynthesize and give it food. If it doesn't have food, it doesn't have that long to swim around, but at some point it settles down onto the bottom, if it's a lucky one, and makes a new little coral polyp, which will then divide into a coral colony. So guys in the back, I'm sorry, what I'm showing here is just a summary of what I just said. So here's an adult coral releasing either eggs and sperm bundles or eggs or sperm. Embryos develop in the water. This cute little planula baby swims around, settles into a new polyp, and begins to divide into a new coral colony. I got to have some fun when I was a graduate student out at Coconut Island. I was interested in, okay, so corals are going to release their eggs or sperm or both into the water. How do they know when to do it? Is it just like Wednesday at noon? And how do they, in February or what? How do they know when to do it? When the moon. Exactly. What can they perceive? What can they perceive? Maybe light, exactly. Tide, exactly. day length, night and day. They don't have eyes. They don't have hearts. They don't have lungs. They don't have kidneys. These are very simple animals. Somehow, and this is still a big question, they perceive and they synchronize, because if you're a lonely coral spawning either eggs or sperm or even both in whenever, and nobody else is doing this, like la la la, right? You've wasted your effort. So you need to do it when everybody else is doing it to make it happen. So in Australia, that big slick I showed you, in Australia, it turns out that most of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef spawn on just a couple of nights after full moon in springtime, between 8 and 10 p.m. So we thought, wow, you guys, thank you for that information. I'm sure that that's going to happen in Hawaii. So they came up here, these two graduate students, and showed us how to look at our coral, break it open, look under the microscope, see what's going on, and try to figure out when our corals are spawning. Hold on to that thought. So some friends and I did an experiment out at Coconut Island. And so we're looking at these tanks right here. And my colleague, Paul Jokiel, who lives up the street, designed this really cool experimental apparatus. See this baby food jar right here? It's got a little light bulb in the middle of it. It's connected to a machine called a rheostat. And he measured the illumination of full moon and figured out, okay, what does a coral see? And can we make that happen in an experiment? So he dials it into this rheostat, and then we decide to mix it up. So we take corals and push their full moon. So we lower the lids on these tanks and mess up their lunar cycle. And then what happens? Well, I have to tell you. So working on this requires that you're doing experiments kind of 24 hours a day. So the corals you expect to spawn, we had a little bit of information. We expected them to spawn at about 9 o'clock at night. So come in the morning and get your work going, and then at the end of the day, I lower the lids on these experimental tanks. And those moons that I just showed you are switched around on some of the corals. But it was hard to be back at 5 o'clock the next morning, so we rigged up this thing, guys. I had a timer that turned on a hose. The hose went into a bucket. The bucket was connected to a line to the coconut tree on and then it connected, and when the bucket filled up, it would drop, and it would open the lids every morning at whatever you dialed it into, so 5:30. Totally my kind of science. So what we found in Hawaii, just to kind of fun, is that Hawaiian corals do not do what Australian corals do. Hawaiian corals divide up the year, divide up the month, divide up the lunar cycle, divide up the time of day that they release their eggs or sperm. They all do it. The species do it at the same time. So the male and the female of that species do it at the same time. But between species, they divide it up. So Hawaii is totally unique in the way the corals reproduce here. When corals grow, it's kind of fun to watch them. They can bud from that little polyp into many and make a colony, or they can break into little pieces and grow new colonies. Some of the ways they bud are that one polyp can divide in the middle, or new polyps can emerge between old ones. And they have amazing growth forms. From a big colony, I've seen one in Kaneohe Bay on the Big Island as big as this room. And some colonies are the size of a quarter. So they grow as a big mound, as big whorls, branches like mushrooms or big whorls. And this is one of our, this is a view of a typical coral reef in Kaneohe Bay. Rice coral and finger coral around it. And it turns out that when corals grow and the branches break off, would this be so cool? A coral can do this. So some corals are branching, and a branch can break off, like this one, and kind of tumble around on the reef and grow a new image of itself, a new colony that's identical to itself. So wouldn't it be fun if each of us could take a piece and grow a new one and let it go, and then let all that go, and then pretty soon there'd be hundreds or thousands of you. So if we made a mistake or goofed up, shoot, we'd have another chance. But that's not how we work. But corals are very simple, and they operate this way. So when I was working on my PhD here long ago, I looked at a reef like this and thought, how many of these colonies are the same? And if you look at this map, see all the red dots? Those are, okay, so this whole area of the room, I mapped it, and so that looks like about 4, 6, 8 of you would all be red, 10 of you would be blue, and you would all be identical genetically. And that was kind of fun to understand that corals can replicate themselves and be genetically identical across an area. So they can reproduce sexually, which gets my mom interested, and asexually, which gets me interested. How fast do they grow? Well, some corals don't grow in a year. We can't even measure it. And some corals grow about this much in a year, about a foot. In Kaneohe Bay, our finger corals, the main coral that you see out here, grows about 3.5 centimeters a year. Just so you know, when people ask you, you can tell them. And corals lay down growth bands. I just love the image of this. And they can grow really, really big. There is a coral in a place I love in American Samoa that we call Big Mama. And she has just been estimated to be how old? Based on what I've just told you. 10 years? 100 years? Good. 2,000 years old. 2,000 years old. Wow. Wow. We're just trying, this data has just been brought in the last couple of months. So it gives us hope that despite the changes in our globe, that corals can persist and adjust, adapt, and we hope we can too. I want to tell you another quick story that happened right out here. I guess about 20 years ago now. So do you know where this place is? Can you see this? Okay, so I can't quite reach it, but Coconut Island is here, okay? We're looking from the north back into Kaneohe Bay. We are right there. And in 1998 New Year's Eve, who was here? Ah, thank you. You and me. It rained. It rained, it rained, it rained, it rained about 9 inches on the Poly in 12 hours. Big, big storm. And the next day in the bay, it looked like this. There was a freshwater layer on the top of the bay about this deep, and there was no wind for about 3 days. So the freshwater layer stayed there. Well, corals are very simple animals, I told you. They do not have an ability to adjust to fresh water. So everything on the top of the reef, not just coral, but everything around it, in the next week, died. You've never smelled anything so bad. I was a graduate student at the time, so they asked me to jump in the water and go survey the reefs. Visibility was like this. That's okay. I jumped into the water off the boat about 65 times in the next 3 weeks to survey what had happened to the reefs right off here all the way up to the North Bay. And we found out, I documented that the corals were dead, make. They were slimy, black, smelly, bad, dead. Well, then I got to go back 6 months later and resurvey these reefs. What happened? Well, a lot of the areas that I had surveyed looked a whole lot better than they had 6 months ago. They weren't nearly as dead. In fact, the same coral colonies were alive, I swear, I'd seen them, and I had checked them off as dead. Well, we wrote a paper on it, and we did some experiments to go back. This is a cross-section of a branch of finger coral. So break it off and look inside, right? Look down into the middle of the skeleton of the finger coral. And you see this brown area out here? Okay. On the outside, it looks very dead, scummy, smelly. But inside, a deeper layer, turns out the coral cells can move inside along with the algae cells and just hang out for a while. When conditions return to better, apparently they can move back out and regrow. We call this the phoenix effect. It looks like it was dead, and now it can regrow. Wow. Wow. There's a lot to learn from what corals can do. All right. I'm going to speed up and wrap up. This looks to me like a Wahoo on a really good day. There are a lot of people who live here. There are a lot of activities going on. We have commerce, we have recreation, we have tourism, and we hope that we have healthy reefs. This is what it looks like when you fly in to the airport, right? It's not as beautiful as that. Some of the water quality doesn't look that great from the air. And we have a lot of issues. You may have heard about alien species on land here. So we have terrestrial invaders in our forests, Jackson's chameleons, invasive birds, the coqui frog, Myconia in the forest, and even common guava are taking over native species. Guess what? It's happening in the ocean as well. We have a number of marine invaders. Some of them were accidental introductions. Some of them were brought in by our resource managers. Some of them were brought in by researchers at University of Hawaii to do research on aquaculture, to try to give another source of income to Pacific Islanders. Well, research was done here in Kaneohe Bay on species that were brought in from the Philippines and Guam and Florida. And this is one of the people who led the research. And it turns out, well, and there was good reason. Here's one of the species, and the products of these algae include all kinds of smoothing agents, pet food, toothpaste stabilizers. We probably come in contact with some of these products on a daily basis. But it turns out that some of these species got loose in Kaneohe Bay specifically. This has become an example of what not to do. Our beautiful bay has had enough challenges. In the last 30 years, this is one of the big ones. The algae are growing faster than the coral, and they're taking over, let me show you again, taking over our beautiful reefs. So in about the last 15 years, a number of people and agencies have gotten together to try to address these questions, doing research to understand what's the deal with these algae. These are a different kind of algae, right? These are things that wash up on the beach in front of here, and grow over your reef. So the research was to look at where these things are in the state, what impacts they have on our native species, and what makes them super weeds. and what can we do to control them? We started doing research over in Waikiki. See all this algae washed up on the beach? This is all alien. And we gathered the community together to help us because we didn't know how to proceed at first. People gathered, these are coffee bags full of alien algae off the reef, took them up onto the shoreline, gathered them and threw them into big dumpsters. This is Ryan, who is really into his work, and we had many, many events, removed many, many tons of algae off the reef, and involved the community. The important thing here is that when you involve the community, they understand what's going on their reefs, they understand the issues, and they put pressure on the people that make the decisions to say, we want to make a change. So this is on the right is what a Hawaiian coral reef, a great Hawaiian coral reef should look like. On the left is what I showed you. And we're trying to figure out still, can we turn this around? And what shall we do? Can we go out there as volunteers and just pull it off and recycle it? What do we do? One thing we've done is to develop this thing called a super sucker. You might have seen it out in the bay. It lives at Coconut Island. Divers go underwater with a big, there's a Italian diesel pump on this barge up here that pulls up a venturi. It pulls everything up onto the boat that the divers push into that hose, up into a sorting table. The water drains through, and it can remove up to 750 pounds of alien algae an hour. But you don't want to waste it. So we have joined forces with an amazing family of farmers, the Rapoons in Waikane, Waihole Valley. They take it and put it on their crops as soil amendment, just like that. Huh. And the cool thing was that at Coconut Island, it worked. So this is before, this is 4 months later after the algae was removed, 11 months later, and look, here's a new little coral coming in, and 14 months later, the coral's growing. It worked very well. We tried to move it throughout the bay to other places and other species. Not so successful. The algae came back faster than it could be removed. So we enlisted another assistant in the endeavor, and this is a native sea urchin called Hawai'i, a collector urchin. Latin is Trypnoustes gratilla. And guess what? These native sea urchins eat the alien algae. So we're trying to make more of them, and we're going to talk about sex just for another second. Here's a female sea urchin, a male sea urchin. You put it together, and it makes a bunch, gazillion baby sea urchins that grow up in about 2 months into this adorable little sea urchin. This is, I know, 1 millimeter. They're tiny. But there's a new facility, kind of a year old now, out at Sand Island. And the state is growing these guys by the tens of thousands and putting them back onto the reef in Kaneohe Bay to see if we can't control this issue of alien algae overgrowth. Yep. Okay, one more little bit I want to talk to you about. Just to, besides the main Hawaiian Islands, do you know that this island chain goes up from Big Island, the Maui Nui complex, Oahu, and then Kauai, and then another 2,500 kilometers up the chain is the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It has been the largest protected area in the world. This is the one closest to the main Hawaiian Islands, Nihoa. Pearl and Hermes a little further up. And the diversity of species and a number of species has become a signal to biologists, a reminder to biologists of what coral reefs look like that aren't impacted by human actions, because there's nobody lives up here. There are amazing species, many protected species. 90% of the sea turtles that we see in the main Hawaiian Islands were born in the Northwesterns. Big, big fish. It's dominated by big, big fish. When we go swimming out here, snorkeling, diving, do you see anything bigger than? Not so much. But in the Northwesterns, most places are dominated by these guys. We call them apex predators. You jump in the water, and you're talking with the guys in the gray suits. In this photo, I have heard there are 80 sharks. There's an abundance of apex predators. So here's the main Hawaiian Islands. The red here shows the percentage in that circle of alua or sharks. In the Northwesterns, look at this, 54% of what you see in the water are the big guys. So it helps us understand the diversity of reefs, the importance of fish, the importance of not taking too many fish, the importance of maintaining a balanced marine ecosystem. So these are reefs in the northern part of Kaneohe Bay that we're working to protect right now. And this is the idyllic place that we'd like to live. Oh, that's it. So I would be very happy to entertain questions and hear your experiences on reefs in Hawaii, from small kid days to now. Thank you.